We've become accustomed to seeing stories about how DNA has defeated unreliable evidence in criminal cases and exonerated people who spent years in prison for crimes they didn't commit. Yet in Lake County, Illinois, that has been turned exactly on its head. In May of 2009, Juan Rivera was convicted for the third time of the brutal rape and murder of a little girl in Lake County, despite DNA evidence excluding him as the source of semen recovered from the child's body.
This is one of the more brutal crimes that anyone could imagine. Holly Staker was an 11-year-old child. She was babysitting children. She was stabbed 27 times. She was raped. It was horrible.
This case is like so many wrongful convictions that we've seen. First, there's a brutal crime. The case grows cold. Then a jailhouse informant comes forward and tells the police that Juan Rivera knew something about the crime. The police are under incredible pressure. They interrogate Juan Rivera. They know the fastest way to convict him and get him charged is to get him to confess.
Expert interrogators will tell you that the time for a proper interrogation is measured in hours, not days. That if one cannot get somebody to confess voluntarily within a few hours, then beyond that we get to enter the realm of coercive interrogation, where confessions that ensue are inherently less reliable. In Juan Rivera's case, the police interrogated him hour after hour after hour, and he knew nothing and said nothing about the case. It was only later, when he, by all accounts, went into an emotional breakdown from the pressure of the interrogation, that he became willing to parrot back to the police anything and everything that they asked him to say.
This case was extremely weak from the beginning. There was a great deal of physical evidence. There was blood, there was hair, there was semen, there were fingerprints, none of it tying Juan Rivera to the crime. Not only was there no physical evidence, but there were no witnesses, and there was nothing in Juan's background to indicate that he'd have a propensity for committing sexual violence or any kind of violence. The only thing they had was a confession. Now, most people have a hard time understanding why a person would confess to a crime he or she didn't commit, particularly a crime like this one. But the more we study wrongful convictions, the more we appreciate how common false confessions are. Which is why, in a case such as this, when the confession was dubious to begin with, and you have hard science pointing away from the defendant, common sense dictates that you've got the wrong guy.
When the DNA results came in showing that Juan Rivera was absolutely not the person who was responsible for the rape of Holly Staker, everybody assumed that that was the end of the case. This was the classic exoneration.
I think this kind of thing happens all over the country. I think that what happens is that police and prosecutors got a conviction and they realized that if they were wrong, they had so much explaining to do about how they possibly could have been wrong, about some of the evidence that they put on. But how did they, if they were wrong, how did they get all these people to say what they said? How did the policemen say what they said if they were wrong? Just about every time you have these wrongful convictions, you have these circumstances that the authorities have to go back and explain, and it's very difficult to do that. So once you've started going down a track, and this is, I think, obviously where the expression "getting railroaded" comes from, is that the prosecutors get on this track, and you can't just get off a railroad track. You can't just say, "Oh, I'll take a turn here. I'll make a turn." Prosecutors and police don't do that very well.
When the case came to trial in 2009, the prosecution had a problem. They had to explain somehow to the jury how Juan could be guilty despite the DNA exclusion. Well, they came up with two theories. One was that the DNA sample had somehow been contaminated. That was provably false. The DNA came from sperm heads, and you can't change the DNA of a sperm head by contaminating the sample. The second theory was even more preposterous.
One of the most outrageous aspects of this case is that the prosecution argued, without any evidence whatsoever, that this 11-year-old child was having consensual sex according to the prosecution, the semen that was recovered from her body was from a prior sexual encounter that they claim happened with someone that they cannot name earlier in the day or the day before.
The problem that advocates for Juan Rivera have is that although there is DNA evidence in the victim that pointed away from Juan Rivera, that excluded him as her rapist, they did not know to whom that belonged, and so the prosecution is able to spin some fanciful and in my mind repellent theory that this 11-year-old girl had sex with somebody else earlier in the day. Absent that plausible actual other suspect, the Rivera people had a very high hurdle to reach, which is they put on a case which asked jurors to believe, well, do you believe these fine, brave and true police officers who tell you that, yeah, this guy Juan Rivera unburdened himself of all this information right in the middle of the night, and he told us all about this crime, including things that only the killer would have known? Or are you going to believe this guy Juan Rivera, even though the DNA didn't match, even though the whole story of his involvement was pretty far-fetched? You had to believe his story, or you had to believe the police. And in cases like that, we've seen over and over again that jurors are willing to believe whatever the police tell them.
For 20 years now, a vicious killer has remained at large, while Juan Rivera has languished in prison for a crime he didn't commit. There was no physical evidence linking him to it. There was no witness. There was no violence in his past, and yet he was convicted. If reasonable doubt means anything, this conviction can't stand, and the police need to reopen the investigation and search for the person who left that semen in Holly Staker's body.